The Arizona sun had barely risen over the Red Rock Canyons when Ayanna entered the small trading post on the outskirts of Fort Verde. At 19, she'd made this journey dozens of times, trading beadwork and leather goods her mother crafted for supplies her family needed. She moved quietly through the store, her deerskin dress and braided hair marking her as Comanche, though her ability to speak English bridged the gap between her world and this one. The trader, old Samuel Wright, had always treated her fairly, a rarity that she valued deeply in these tense times, but today something felt different. The usual customers avoided her gaze, and whispers followed her movements through the aisles. Samuel's face was troubled when she approached the counter with her goods, and he gestured for her to follow him to the back room, away from prying eyes. Once alone, he explained in hushed tones that bounty hunters had arrived in town the previous day, spreading word that a Comanche girl matching her description was wanted for horse theft and assault. They carried papers, official-looking documents claiming a substantial reward for her capture. Ayanna's heart raced with confusion and fear. She'd stolen nothing, harmed no one. Her people had been trading peacefully for months, trying to maintain good relations, despite increasing pressure to move to the reservation. Samuel believed her innocence, but he warned that belief wouldn't protect her from men motivated by reward money. He urged her to leave immediately, to return to her village and stay hidden until the matter could be resolved. But Ayanna knew that running would only make her look guilty, and her family depended on the trade she conducted. As she prepared to leave through the back entrance, voices erupted from the front of the store. The bounty hunters had arrived, 3 rough men with hard eyes and weapons displayed prominently. Their leader, a man with a scarred face and cruel smile, was demanding to know if anyone had seen the Comanche girl. Ayanna froze, trapped between the storage room and discovery, her mind racing through impossible options. Samuel moved to block the doorway to the back, buying her precious seconds, but she could hear the hunter's boots approaching, and she knew her peaceful life had just shattered into something dangerous and unpredictable. Lieutenant Daniel Cooper sat on the porch of the Fort Verde infirmary, his left shoulder still bandaged from the bullet wound he'd received 3 weeks earlier. The injury had come during a tense encounter with raiders, not Native Americans, but white outlaws preying on both settlers and indigenous peoples. The experience had left Daniel questioning much of what he'd been taught about frontier conflict, seeing firsthand how complicated the reality was compared to the simple narratives of civilization versus savagery. His recovery was progressing well, but the fort doctor insisted he avoid strenuous duty for another week. From his vantage point, Daniel had a clear view of the trading post across the dusty street. He'd been watching idly, grateful for any distraction from the monotony of recovery, when he noticed the 3 men entering Wright's store with purposeful strides. Something about their manner set off alarm bells in his military training. These weren't casual shoppers or honest traders. They moved like predators, and the bulge of weapons under their coats was poorly concealed. Daniel's attention sharpened, his hand instinctively moving toward where his sidearm would normally rest. Though he was currently unarmed per infirmary regulations, he watched as a young Comanche woman appeared from the side of the building, moving quickly but trying not to draw attention. She wore traditional dress, but carried herself with a confidence that suggested familiarity with settler towns. Daniel recognized her vaguely from previous sightings around the fort, always trading peacefully, never causing trouble. But now she was clearly fleeing something, and the timing with the 3 men's arrival seemed more than coincidental. His military instincts warred with his practical situation. He was wounded, unarmed, and technically off duty, but something about the scene unfolding felt deeply wrong. The decision was made for him when one of the men emerged from the trading post, spotted the woman, and shouted for his companions. The girl broke into a run, heading toward the cluster of buildings near the fort, and the 3 men gave chase with weapons drawn. Daniel rose from his seat, despite the pain shooting through his shoulder, years of training overriding caution. Whatever was happening, it was happening in broad daylight in a supposedly peaceful settlement, and every instinct told him that the hunters, not the hunted, were the real threat. He moved as quickly as his injury allowed, following the pursuit and hoping he could intervene before violence erupted in the streets. Ayanna's breath came in sharp gasps as she ran between buildings, her knowledge of the town's layout giving her brief advantage over the pursuing bounty hunters. She'd hoped to reach the small stable where she'd left her horse, but the men were faster than expected, cutting off her route and forcing her toward the open area near the fort's main gate. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed it down, focusing on survival. Her father had taught her that panic kills, clear thinking saves lives, and she needed every bit of wisdom now. She ducked into an alley between the blacksmith shop and a storage building, pressing against the wall and trying to control her breathing. The hunters' voices echoed from nearby streets, coordinating their search with the efficiency of experienced trackers. Ayana realized with sinking dread that they would find her within minutes. Her options were running out, and fighting 3 armed men would be futile. She briefly considered surrendering, hoping to prove her innocence. But something in their voices, the eagerness, the casual discussion of reward money, told her these men weren't interested in justice. Daniel rounded the corner just as the scarred leader spotted Ayana's hiding place. The bounty hunter raised his rifle, and without thinking, Daniel stepped directly into his line of fire, his officer's uniform immediately recognizable despite his lack of weapons. His voice came out with the command he'd learned to project over battlefield chaos, ordering the man to lower his weapon and state his business. The sudden appearance of a cavalry officer clearly threw the hunters off balance, and they hesitated. Uncertainty replacing their predatory confidence, the scarred man recovered quickly, introducing himself as Wade Johnson and claiming they were pursuing a wanted criminal, producing the supposed warrant from his coat. Daniel held out his hand for the document, noting how Johnson hesitated before handing it over. As Daniel scanned the poorly forged paper, full of official-sounding language but lacking proper seals or signatures, he felt anger rising. This was a fraud, and a dangerous one that could get an innocent person hurt or worse. He looked from the paper to Ayana, who watched him with wary hope, then back to Johnson and made a decision that would change both their lives. He declared the warrant invalid and ordered the bounty hunters to leave fort property immediately. Johnson's face darkened with barely contained rage at Daniel's interference. He argued that the warrant was legitimate, that the Comanche girl was a known thief and potentially dangerous, and that a wounded officer had no authority to interfere with lawful bounty hunting. Daniel stood his ground despite the pain radiating from his shoulder, pointing out that bounty hunting required proper documentation, which this clearly wasn't, and that any attempted capture on fort property fell under military jurisdiction. The standoff drew attention from soldiers and civilians alike, a crowd gathering to witness the confrontation. Ayana remained silent throughout the exchange, her dark eyes moving between Daniel and the bounty hunters, trying to understand why this soldier was defending her. In her experience, cavalry officers represented authority that rarely worked in favor of her people. Treaties broken, promises forgotten, her tribe's gradual displacement all bore the mark of military decisions. Yet here was one of those officers placing himself between her and danger, risking his reputation and possibly more for someone he didn't know. The confusion was almost as overwhelming as the fear. The arrival of Captain Harrison, Daniel's commanding officer, shifted the dynamic again. Harrison demanded an explanation for the disturbance, and both Daniel and Johnson spoke simultaneously, their accounts conflicting sharply. The captain examined the supposed warrant with experienced eyes and reached the same conclusion Daniel had. The document was at best questionable, at worst an outright forgery. He informed Johnson that any further action would require proper verification through official channels, and until then, the girl was under military protection pending investigation of the accusations. Johnson and his men had no choice but to withdraw, but not before Johnson made clear this wasn't over. He claimed they'd return with proper documentation and that interfering with bounty hunters carried consequences. As they left, Daniel finally turned his full attention to Ayana, asking in careful English if she was unharmed and if she understood what had just happened. Her response was equally careful, explaining her innocence and thanking him for his intervention, while making clear she hadn't asked for his help. The pride in her voice reminded Daniel that rescue could feel like another form of control, and he'd need to navigate this situation with more sensitivity than simple military authority allowed. Captain Harrison assigned Daniel the task of investigating the accusations against Ayana, a duty that served multiple purposes. It kept his recovering officer occupied with light duty. It provided oversight of a potentially sensitive situation, and it placed responsibility squarely on Daniel's shoulders for the decision he'd made. Daniel accepted the assignment, knowing it would make him unpopular with those who viewed any defense of Native Americans as betrayal, but his sense of justice outweighed his concern for reputation. The investigation began with interviewing Ayanna properly, a process complicated by mutual suspicion and cultural barriers despite their shared language. Daniel arranged for them to meet at Samuel Wright's trading post, neutral ground where she might feel more comfortable. Samuel vouched for her character, providing records of years of honest trading and explaining that Ayanna's family had been among the most peaceful in their dealings with settlers. The old trader's testimony carried weight. As Samuel was respected by both military and civilian communities, Ayanna gradually shared her story, explaining her family's situation caught between traditional Comanche life and the inexorable pressure to move onto reservations. They'd chosen a middle path, maintaining cultural identity while engaging in peaceful trade, hoping to prove that coexistence was possible. The false accusations threatened not just her but her family's entire strategy for survival. As she spoke, Daniel began understanding the complexity of her position, constantly navigating between worlds, trusted fully by neither, yet trying to build bridges that others seemed determined to burn. Daniel's investigation into the warrant's origins proved difficult. The document claimed to originate from a town 3 days' ride away, but telegraph inquiries revealed no such warrant existed in their records. The sheriff there had never heard of Ayanna, or any Comanche woman matching her description wanted for crimes. Daniel documented everything meticulously, building a case that the accusations were fabricated. But the question remained, why? Why would bounty hunters create false charges against a peaceful trader? The answer, when it came, revealed a conspiracy darker than simple greed. The truth emerged through an unexpected source, a young man named Thomas Gray, who worked occasionally with the bounty hunters and whose conscience finally overcame his fear. He sought out Daniel privately, revealing that Wade Johnson had been hired by a local businessman, Marcus Thornton, who wanted Comanche traders driven away from the area. Thornton owned competing trading operations and resented the quality and prices of Native American goods that cut into his profits. Creating wanted criminals was his solution, frightening away traders or getting them arrested, eliminating competition while appearing to support law and order. Daniel recognized Thornton's name immediately. The businessman had significant influence in the territory, connections with territorial government, and the kind of wealth that made men feel untouchable. Accusing him directly would require ironclad evidence and would likely end Daniel's military career regardless of the truth. Thomas's testimony alone wouldn't be enough. The word of a bounty hunter's assistant against a prominent businessman would be dismissed immediately. Daniel needed more documentation witnesses, something that couldn't be easily discredited or ignored. He shared this information with Ayanna during their next meeting, explaining both the discovery and the challenge of proving it. Her reaction surprised him with its lack of surprise. She explained that her people had long suspected outside forces were working to undermine their trading relationships, that the increasing hostility hadn't felt organic but orchestrated. Other traders had faced similar accusations in recent months, forcing them to abandon routes or relocate to reservations for safety. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it, a systematic effort to eliminate Native American economic independence. Together, they began planning how to expose Thornton's scheme. It was a strange partnership, the wounded cavalry officer and the Comanche trader, brought together by circumstances neither would have chosen. Daniel was risking his career and possibly his life, challenging powerful interests with limited authority and significant vulnerability. Ayanna was risking even more, trusting someone whose uniform represented generations of broken promises and betrayals. Yet both recognized that sometimes the right path isn't the safe one, and that justice requires courage from unexpected places. The question was whether their courage would be enough against forces determined to maintain profitable injustice. Daniel's investigation took him beyond the fort's walls, asking questions in town that made people uncomfortable and attracted unwanted attention. He interviewed other traders who dealt with Thornton, finding patterns of intimidation and suspicious incidents that aligned with Ayana's experiences. Several settlers spoke carefully, clearly afraid of retaliation, but hinting at knowledge of Thornton's methods. The businessman had built his empire through ruthlessness, disguised as respectability. And challenging him meant confronting an entire system designed to protect powerful men from consequences. Ayana contributed her own evidence, bringing Daniel to meet other Comanche families who'd been targeted by false accusations or unexplained harassment. Each story added pieces to the larger picture, revealing a coordinated campaign to drive native traders from profitable routes. The families shared their experiences cautiously, uncertain whether a cavalry officer could be trusted, but willing to risk it because Ayana vouched for Daniel's integrity. Her willingness to trust him despite everything carried weight that his uniform couldn't provide. The investigation brought Daniel and Ayana into closer collaboration, spending long hours comparing notes and building their case. Through these conversations, they began understanding each other beyond the roles they'd been assigned by society. Daniel learned about Comanche culture, values, and the daily struggles of maintaining identity under constant pressure to abandon it. Ayana learned about Daniel's background, his reasons for joining the military, and his growing disillusionment with policies that prioritized expansion over justice. They discovered common ground in unexpected places, shared beliefs about honor, family, and the responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Their growing friendship didn't go unnoticed. Soldiers at the fort questioned Daniel's judgment, suggesting his injury had affected his thinking or that he was being manipulated by a clever native woman. Townspeople whispered about impropriety, their imaginations filling gaps with scandalous assumptions. Even Ayana's family expressed concern, worried that association with a soldier would bring more trouble than help. Both Daniel and Ayana felt the pressure of disapproval from their respective communities, the price of crossing boundaries that others believed should remain firmly in place. Yet they continued, driven by a growing conviction that what they were doing mattered more than what people thought about it. Marcus Thornton finally made his move after learning about Daniel's investigation. He couldn't silence a military officer directly without raising questions, but he could discredit him. Thornton arranged for stolen goods to be planted in Ayana's family camp, then sent the sheriff with a legitimate search warrant. The evidence was discovered exactly where Thornton's informant said it would be, and suddenly Ayana wasn't just accused by questionable bounty hunters, but by actual law enforcement with physical proof. Daniel received word of Ayana's arrest while at the fort and immediately rode to town despite his still healing shoulder. He found her in the small jail, maintaining her dignity despite obvious fear and anger. She insisted she knew nothing about the stolen goods, that they'd been planted. But Daniel could see how damning the evidence appeared. Thornton had been clever, using Daniel's investigation against them, allowing the officer to expose the bounty hunter scheme, only to replace it with something that looked more legitimate. The situation seemed hopeless. The stolen goods were real, taken from Thornton's own warehouse according to records. Witnesses could testify they'd been missing. The discovery in Ayana's camp appeared lawful and proper. Any claim of planted evidence would sound like desperate excuse-making. Thornton's trap was nearly perfect, and Daniel realized he'd underestimated his opponent's ruthlessness and resources. Looking at Ayana through the cell bars, seeing the betrayal and disappointment in her eyes, he felt the weight of his failure to protect her despite his promises. But Samuel Wright arrived with unexpected information that shifted everything again. The old trader had been doing his own investigating, talking to warehouse workers who knew more than they'd told officials. One worker, facing his own troubles with Thornton, revealed that the supposedly stolen goods had never actually left the warehouse, that Thornton had simply moved them to a different location and reported them stolen. The items found in Ayana's camp were different goods made to look similar, purchased specifically for the frame-up. Samuel had documentation, warehouse manifests that didn't match the sheriff's inventory, and a worker willing to testify of promised protection from Thornton's retaliation. Armed with Samuel's evidence, Daniel requested a formal hearing before the territorial judge, using his authority as an investigating officer to demand proper legal procedure. Captain Harrison, increasingly concerned about the situation's implications for military-civilian relations, supported the request. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. Thornton couldn't refuse without appearing guilty, but he arrived with expensive lawyers and an air of confidence that suggested he still believed he'd prevail. The hearing room was packed with curious townspeople, soldiers from the fort, and members of Ayana's community who'd come to support her. The tension was palpable, different factions eyeing each other with suspicion and hostility. Judge Wilson, a fair-minded man respected for his integrity, presided with stern attention to proper procedure. Daniel presented his evidence methodically, building the case that Ayana had been systematically targeted through false accusations, planted evidence, and conspiracy designed to eliminate competition. Thornton's lawyers attacked every point, questioning witnesses' credibility, suggesting Daniel was biased by inappropriate friendship with the accused, arguing that even if some accusations were false, the physical evidence of theft was undeniable. They painted Ayana as a clever manipulator who deceived a naive officer, playing on prejudices about Native Americans and their supposed inability to conduct honest business. The arguments were effective, and Daniel could see some observers nodding in agreement, their existing beliefs reinforced by eloquent legal rhetoric, but Samuel's testimony proved devastating to Thornton's case. The old trader presented his warehouse manifests with calm precision, pointing out discrepancies that couldn't be explained by honest mistakes. The worker who'd agreed to testify, trembling but determined, explained exactly how Thornton had orchestrated the frame-up. Under cross-examination, he provided details that only someone with direct knowledge could know, and his obvious fear of retaliation actually strengthened his credibility. Judge Wilson's expression grew increasingly stern as the scope of Thornton's deception became clear. Judge Wilson's ruling came after 2 hours of deliberation that felt like an eternity to everyone involved. He declared all charges against Ayana dismissed, finding that she'd been the victim of conspiracy and false accusation. Furthermore, he ordered an investigation into Marcus Thornton's business practices and potential criminal charges for fraud, false reporting, and conspiracy. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions: celebration from Ayana's supporters, shock and anger from Thornton's allies, and tense silence from those uncertain what this meant for future relations between settlers and Native Americans. Thornton's face turned purple with rage as he was escorted from the courtroom, shouting threats about appeals and connections in territorial government. His lawyers tried to calm him, aware that his outburst was only damaging his case further. Wade Johnson and his fellow bounty hunters, realizing their employer was facing legal consequences, quietly disappeared from town that very evening, avoiding their own potential charges. The victory was significant, but Daniel knew it was also incomplete. Thornton's wealth and influence meant he'd likely avoid serious punishment, and the attitudes that enabled his scheme remained unchanged. Ayana's release from custody brought emotional celebration from her family and community. They gathered around her with tears of relief and joy, offering prayers of gratitude to their spirits and acknowledging Daniel's role with cautious respect. Several elders approached Daniel specifically, thanking him in their language with Samuel translating, explaining that his actions had restored some faith that justice was possible even in this difficult time. The recognition moved Daniel deeply, understanding the significance of their trust, given the history between their peoples. Captain Harrison summoned Daniel the following day for a private conversation about his future. The captain acknowledged that Daniel's actions had been honorable and ultimately vindicated, but he couldn't ignore the political reality. Powerful interests were angry about Thornton's exposure, and Daniel had made enemies who would make his continued service at Fort Verde difficult. Harrison offered a choice: accept a transfer to a different post where Daniel could start fresh, or remain and face likely career stagnation and ongoing hostility. The choice was difficult, but it also forced Daniel to examine what he truly wanted from his military career and his life. Daniel requested time to consider the captain's offer, using the days to think carefully about his future. His military career had been his entire identity since enlisting at 18, the structure and purpose defining who he was. But the recent events had revealed aspects of that identity he hadn't fully examined. The blind spots, The ways his service sometimes supported injustice rather than preventing it. The complicated truth that honor and duty didn't always align. Leaving would mean starting over. Staying would mean accepting limitations. And both options carried significant costs. He discussed the situation with Ayanna during one of their now regular conversations at Samuel's trading post, a neutral space where they could meet without attracting excessive attention. She listened carefully to his dilemma, then offered perspective shaped by her own experiences of living between worlds. She explained that her people understood difficult choices, having faced them for generations, choosing between tradition and adaptation, between fighting and accommodating, between maintaining identity and ensuring survival. There were no perfect answers, only the best decision you could make with the information and options available. Ayanna shared her own plans, revealing that her family had decided to accept a place on the reservation after all. The victory over Thornton hadn't changed the larger reality that the territory was becoming increasingly hostile to independent native traders. The reservation offered limited but real security, a chance to preserve their community and culture, even if it meant accepting restrictions on their freedom. The decision pained her, feeling like surrender, but she recognized it as pragmatic choice rather than defeat. Sometimes survival required compromising on methods while maintaining core values. Their conversation deepened into territory beyond immediate concerns, discussing dreams and disappointments, hopes and fears, the people they'd been and who they wanted to become. Daniel realized that his friendship with Ayanna had changed him fundamentally, teaching him to question assumptions and see beyond the simple narratives he'd been taught. She admitted that knowing him had restored some faith in the possibility of understanding between their peoples, that individual relationships could transcend historical conflicts, even when systems remained broken. The bond between them was complicated, built on crisis and sustained by mutual respect, and neither knew exactly what it meant or where it could lead. Daniel made his decision after a week of careful thought. He would accept the transfer, recognizing that staying at Fort Verde would only breed resentment and limit his effectiveness. But he also requested assignment to a post focused on peaceful relations with native tribes, applying the lessons he'd learned to work that might actually make a positive difference. Captain Harrison approved the request, respecting Daniel's choice, even while acknowledging the challenges of the path he'd chosen. The transfer would take effect in 1 month, giving Daniel time to complete his recovery and prepare for the move. The news of Daniel's departure reached Ayanna through Samuel, and she sought him out to say goodbye properly. They met at dawn on the outskirts of town, the early light painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Ayanna brought him a gift, a leather bracelet her mother had crafted with traditional Comanche patterns, explaining that it represented courage and honor, qualities she believed he embodied. Daniel accepted it with gratitude that went beyond words, knowing the significance of such a gift from her family. They talked about the future with cautious optimism. Daniel would be moving to New Mexico, where tensions between military and tribes were also high, but where his new assignment offered opportunities to build understanding rather than enforce separation. Ayanna's family would be settling on the reservation in Oklahoma, maintaining their community while adapting to new realities. The distance would be significant, and both acknowledged the unlikelihood of meeting again, yet neither spoke of permanent goodbye. Instead, they talked about the impact they'd had on each other, how the crisis that brought them together had changed both their perspectives and lives. Samuel organized a farewell gathering at his trading post the night before Daniel's departure, bringing together an unlikely group of soldiers, settlers, and Native Americans who'd been affected by the recent events. The gathering wasn't large or formal, but it represented something rare in that time and place, people from different worlds choosing to acknowledge common humanity. Stories were shared, food was passed around, and for a few hours, the boundaries that usually divided them felt less absolute. Daniel looked around the room and saw the possibility of a different future, one where justice and understanding could coexist with cultural differences. As Daniel rode away from Fort Verde the next morning, his shoulder finally healed and his perspective permanently altered, he carried with him more than just new orders and travel papers. He carried the memory of a Comanche girl who'd been brave enough to trust him, despite every reason not to, and the knowledge that he'd been brave enough to deserve that trust. The bracelet on his wrist was a reminder that honor transcends uniforms and heritage, that defending what's right sometimes means standing alone, and that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons, but with the courage to see others as fully human, regardless of the differences between you. Ayana watched him go from a distant ridge, her own journey toward the reservation beginning the following week. She'd entered that trading post weeks ago, expecting just another routine day, never imagining she'd find herself hunted, defended, and ultimately transformed by the experience. The wounded soldier who'd stood up for her honor had shown her that individuals could break free from the prejudices of their time. That change was possible even when systems remained resistant. As she turned her horse toward home, she carried her own lessons from their unlikely alliance about the power of trust, the importance of fighting injustice wherever you found it, and the surprising places where you might find true friendship. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and unforgiving, a landscape that had witnessed countless conflicts and rare moments of connection. Two people had crossed paths in that desert, brought together by crisis and separated by circumstance, but permanently changed by the brief time they'd stood together against injustice. Their story would be forgotten by history, too small and personal to merit official record, but the impact rippled outward in ways neither could fully measure. Sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones that change everything, but the ones that change someone, proving that courage and honor matter even when the world makes them difficult, and that defending another person's dignity is always worth the cost.